Good morning. Mr. Karadžić, please continue. Please plan your statement so as to leave about 10 minutes at the end of today's hearing for a Chamber's oral ruling.
Hvala, Ekscelencije.
Thank you, Your Excellencies. As we saw yesterday, in an incredible rhythm, or a shocking rhythm that prevailed in Croatia, there was a shocking measure introduced each month affecting the Serbs. The same situation was with us. Before I come to the October declaration adopted by the SDA and HDZ deputies, contrary to the way the assembly sessions are convened and contrary to the provisions of the constitutions of Yugoslavia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. As a follow-up, I would just like to add that the SDS was the last ethnic party to be established. We did that reluctantly because we didn't think that ethnic democracy was a proper thing, but we were forced by the events to do so. The elections took place on the 18th of November, and each nationalist party won because all the peoples adopted ethnic differentiations based partly on fears and partly on the ambitions that they hadn't had before in Yugoslavia. The government was formed in January 1991. And the first campaign for an independent Bosnia and Herzegovina started in January. Although Mr. Izetbegović vowed to remain in Yugoslavia in January as well. Then in February, Mr. Izetbegović formed a secret council for the defense of Muslims, although he was the chairman of the Public Council for Defense of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Serbs expressed their protest during the first campaign for independence. After Izetbegović has formed this council, which acted as the command of the secret army of the SDA, the Serbian public did not protest against this, although we knew that that was happening. There was an attempt in February to adopt a declaration on sovereignty and independence. The Serbs protested and filed a veto and referred the matter to the Council for National Defense. And we announced that we were going to work on communities of municipalities, because municipalities can adopt different decisions based on their economic interests. The Patriotic League was established on the 31st of March, and the Supreme Command now has its army. The Serbs were deeply concerned over this. The Serbs employed in the police and the MUP that were brought into power, although they were not members of the SDS, because we don't think that there should be any political affiliations in the police. They tried to prevent any abuse of the police and to inform the public about what was going on. This was the first time that we, in a way, had some misunderstandings with our deputy minister that we nominated for that position. So in March 1991, a second attempt to adopt a declaration on independence took place. After these consultations with our partners, we lodged a veto and continued consultations with the municipalities. Famously, the declaration on the sovereignty of Bosnia and Herzegovina will be passed with or without the Serbian delegates, is what Alija Izetbegović said in March 1991. So we have consumed all the brotherhood of unity and all the idyllic relationships, and the abuse of the police gathered pace. The police was full of criminals, and you heard yesterday from my conversation with the deputy minister, in which he agreed that we didn't bring any new personnel to the police, unlike them, and we particularly didn't bring in any criminals as they did. The SDA personnel in the police were keeping everything secret from the Serbs. They are keeping them away from all the illegal activities that they were involved in, and that was the first split that happened in the MUP in May 1991, and it affected actually the de facto division of the MUP. So our personnel had no insight into the events and no impact on it. The Serbian autonomous areas were proclaimed, but nothing was going on. They were there just in case if something happened, and if communications are cut off, the people would be severed from their leadership, and they, in that case, should have some regional leaderships to lead them. In June 1991, decisions were taken on this independence of Slovenia and Croatia, and Kučan, Tudjman, and Izetbegović concluding a secret agreement to attack the JNA and Yugoslavia. This conspiracy and this secret pact will be confirmed here thanks to the evidence provided by the prosecution, and we also have our own sources of information. Now, there's already talk about regionalization, and we thought that they should start functioning because this was no joke any longer. All our moves were imposed on us. These were not our goals. That was done out of necessity. If you do not annul these unlawful decisions, we are going to activate our plans. The German newspapers Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung and Die Welt wrote about Yugoslavia that it was a historical freak created through agreements from the Paris Conference, and they periphery interprets correction, and they were mocking the Versailles, Saint-Germain, Trianon, and the Ney agreements that ended the First World War. Let me remind you that in 1977 and 1978, while Tito was still alive, Josef Strauss gathered the European elite in Munich and tried to persuade them to proclaim Yugoslavia dead. By courtesy of General Galois, we acquired this information. General Galois is an exceptional personality who didn't agree with that either then or now. In June, the Serbs proposed their ideas in Serbian and in English. Now, I wonder why the prosecution doesn't mention this agreement at all, and why they did not want to learn what the Serbian position was vis-à-vis Yugoslavia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Their proposal was that because that was such an important time, the crisis was accelerating, and the Serbs proposed a solution for the Yugoslav and the Bosnian crisis. This proposal excludes absolutely any possibility or any notion of a joint criminal enterprise. So that should be excluded from the indictment as well. In the beginning of July, the Muslim Bosniak organization led by Adil Zulfikarpašić and Muhammad Filipović, who had left the SDA once they learned about the conspiracy that was being pursued behind the backs of the whole party and the whole Muslim people. When Filipović and Zulfikarpašić, as experienced politicians and dissidents of long standing, needed some time to see where all these moves were leading to. This led Mr. Čaušević, after leaving the SDA, to say to Mr. Begović the following: do you think that the Serbs are fools who cannot see what you are doing? The Serb side was delighted with this proposal of the Serbian-Muslim agreement, and they decided to abandon all the countermeasures that they had envisaged. And these countermeasures were conceived in order to thwart the violation of our constitutional rights, provided that the Muslim side would give up the way that they have taken. Mr. Zulfikarpašić and I met with Mr. Begović, who said, just go on, and he said to Zulfikarpašić, please continue your work, because the Serbs don't trust me any longer, and maybe you can achieve something. In July and August of 1991, we were working on this historic Serbian-Muslim agreement. We had joint meetings that were full of tensions, but the leaderships of the SDS and the MBO were visiting sensitive areas such as Trebinje, and they are holding rallies there. But everybody was happy, both the Serbs and the Muslims. Then we went to Zvornik, which was also a sensitive area, which exploded at a later stage. People were delighted. We had a crowded sports hall, and they were happy to see that there was a change in the relations between the Serbs and the Muslims. So during this 6-month period, we didn't apply any countermeasures that we had envisaged, because we reached an agreement with the Muslims. Towards the end of August, all of a sudden, Mr. Izetbegović withdrew his support to this agreement, while Professor Koljević and Professor Filipović, both from the philosophical faculty, who were authorized by Zulfikarpašić and myself to continue our work, presented this agreement to the public with a view to relaxing the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, to say that Bosnia is a tripartite state, Bosnian, Croats and Muslims, and to convince them that there were no problems. Although there were conflicts in Croatia already going on, but they said that this would prevent spillover into Bosnia. The MBL and Mr. Filipović were proclaimed traitors of the Muslim nation. So all this game of trying to deceive the Muslims and the Serbs with the aim of defeating politically the MBO, that would have amounted to a Pyrrhus victory. That was really a costly and dear victory. Immediately the following day, tensions rose in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the Serbian side, particularly the autonomous region of Krajina, without asking us anything about it, proclaimed an autonomous region of the Krajina. We have an intercept on this subject, and we can always show it to the Trial Chamber should they find it of interest. After that, Izetbegovic withdrew, and we adopted a declaration in the Assembly whose basic elements were, firstly, that all options should be treated as equal, and secondly, that there would be no imposition of solutions by any party. A solution had to be found that would be acceptable for everyone involved without any imposition, and all options were legitimate. So this relaxed the situation a bit, but they didn't last longer than a month. By mid-October, we have this famous assembly session where a constitutional coup d'etat took place, where the continuation of the session was convened unlawfully, and all the Serbian deputies, all 83 of them, 72 from the SDS and the Serbs from other multi-ethnic parties, walked out of the assembly, and the Serbian side announced that unless these decisions were revoked within a week, then the Serbian side was going to establish their own assembly as a kind of personal autonomy. This is a pivotal moment for both the prosecution and the indictment. In paragraph 34 of the pretrial brief, the prosecution says the leadership of the Bosnian Serbs established on the 24th of October 1991 a separate Serbian assembly. As Karadžić explained to the delegates, this was a historic move which dispelled the last illusions that the Serbs might have. It will help them to recognize who their friends or foes were, and they will never again be threatened from internal forces. So Karadžić said this is the point when we gave up on all our illusions. We know exactly who our enemies and who our friends are, and we know exactly where threats are coming from. Therefore, in November 1991, again in paragraph 34, it reads that immediately before the SDS plebiscite, on which the Serbs confirmed that they wanted to remain in Yugoslavia, Karadžić invited the municipal authorities to establish their own power in their respective areas. Please be very energetic in pursuing this policy and establish your power, and prepare yourselves for restructuring and regionalization based on municipalities. This is a quotation of my words by the prosecution. But this does not have the meaning that was attributed to it by the OTP. I'd like to remind you that between the 24th of October, when the Serbs realized where the SDS was leading the nation, the Serbs accepted before the beginning of the war several chances and options for peace, and they even were prepared to give up on their own assembly.
So Serbs established an assembly as their last defense. If all else failed, they would have that assembly. As the trial chamber says in the Karadžić judgment, paragraph 195 or 196, if the old system fell apart, the central government has to do something in order to prevent the ground from falling apart. And what is stated here? Prepare your own territories if the central government fails, and if the municipalities have no one to rely upon, or if they call the central government is going to issue them orders that are contrary to the survival of the people, then we have to organize ourselves. We already have our authorities there, but they have to function in extraordinary circumstances. I believe, and I think that all international documents corroborate that it is better to have any kind of authority than no authority at all. Chaos is the worst that you can have. It is no longer only the SDS that represents the Serbs. All the Serbs are there, and they schedule a plebiscite for November 1991. Let us see whether the people want what Izetbegovic is insisting upon, or do the people want something else? The referendum question has to do with Yugoslavia, with the joining of all who wish to remain in Yugoslavia, and that referendum was indeed held. Since this was an ethnic referendum, there was a possibility for others to vote as well, and indeed, between 40 to 60,000 Muslims and Croats did vote in the referendum, and they voted in favor of preserving Yugoslavia. I am afraid that the prosecution is being malicious when they say that this was a yellow leaflet. I don't know what the color of this ballot or leaflet was, but it was written in the Latin script. Most Serbs use the Cyrillic script, but it was printed in Latin so that they would find it more pleasant, as it were. Now, on the 20th of December, the government of Bosnia-Herzegovina, contrary to the position and opinion of all Serb ministers and deputy ministers who were members of the government, passed a decision to ask the European community to recognize an independent Bosnia-Herzegovina. There are no prerequisites for that. That decision was not made in the right way. It could not have been reached at the referendum either, because less than two-thirds of all voters voted in favor of that, and it also couldn't pass through the assembly because we had over two-thirds. And it's not a government that asks for independence. It can only be an assembly on the basis of more than two-thirds of all MP votes. We are going to make you aware of each and every detail of this assembly because it is often exploited. They ask for an annulment of this independence, or as a countermeasure, they are going to proclaim a Serb Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Let us have a look at this map. The Serbs are blue. This was 1991. It didn't change much. That's basically the way it was. After the genocide in the Second World War, the Serbs continue to live they are a majority rather, in two-thirds of the territory of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and regrettably, they have only one-third. Up until the Second World War, they were the majority population. The SDA refuses to withdraw this request, and they move on. From the 20th of December until the 9th of January, they were given 20 days. On the 29th, they were given this time to decide. On the 29th of January, the Serb Republic was proclaimed. But like all other Serb measures, it's just treated as a possibility. It doesn't really function. So the prosecution is not right when they believe that we established the Assembly of the Serb People in order to achieve some objectives. We are actually right. We established the Serb Assembly in order to prevent the SDA from achieving their objectives at the expense of our security and our own will. We can see on the basis of all the interim steps taken, and one of the interim steps was the assembly that was held on the 24th and 25th of January, where Karadžić and Cengić. This is Mohamed Cengić from the SDA. It's not the MBO anymore. The MBO all the time was in favor of reaching an agreement with the Serbs. Now the vice president of the SDA, Cengić, we mentioned that yesterday, reaches agreement with me at the rostrum itself. This is very well-known footage. We all agree at the same time that the government carries out a regionalization within 15 days, and the Serbs vote in the referendum. Whatever they do, they vote, and in this way give the referendum legitimacy. Izetbegović initiated the referendum because Cengić publicly said that it was Izetbegović who authorized him in this manner. It lasted only for 2 hours. With the MBO, the agreement lasted for 2 months, whereas this one lasted only for 2 hours. Now what happens? February, the conference starts. Although we had been receiving monitors from the EU a lot earlier, like Ambassador Vainans, Ambassador Cutiliero, Lord Carrington, etc. But officially, it is in February that the conference started, and on the 22nd or 23rd of February, definitely what is reached is an agreement on 3 Bosnias. The Serbs said, right, we are going to leave Yugoslavia. We are going to leave Yugoslavia and remain within the framework of these boundaries of Bosnia and Herzegovina once they are recognized, on the condition that we get this one unit inside and that Bosnia is a compound, decentralized state where Serbs, Croats, and Muslims are going to have those guarantees and that security that the republics in Yugoslavia had, however, at a far lower level. On the 22nd or 23rd of February, a decision was made to the effect that the future constituent units will have their own powers. Inter alia, they will have the right to their autonomous sovereign police that is accountable only to that government and that assembly. Since we had experience already to the effect that, say, yesterday we reached agreement on 10 points, and Mr. Izetbegović the next day comes and says that we had agreed to nothing, 0. We say, if we agreed on 10 questions, tomorrow we discuss the 11th question. We cannot go back to square one yet again. So then we adopt the principle, nothing has been agreed upon until everything is agreed upon. And then we have to go on. Then the Assembly reaches a decision. The Serb Assembly and the Council of Ministers on the 28th of February decides that preparations are carried out for establishing a Serb MUP. And why immediately after the agreement? Because there was massive, massive abuse of the joint police, the Muslim police. They were wreaking havoc. We can see that, as testified by prosecution witnesses, that the police, the Muslim part of the police, and the SDA and the Patriotic League had all become one. And you cannot distinguish between different institutions anymore. But we will go back to this abuse. So, on the 28th of February and on the 1st of March, there was a referendum. The Serbs did not vote in the referendum, but they didn't prevent it from happening either. We had our own in November, our plebiscite. All right, but if they wanted a two-ethnic, bi-ethnic referendum, let them have it, but it did not happen in a lawful way. On the 1st of March, criminals, well-known criminals, notorious criminals who are now activists of the Patriotic League, they killed the members of a wedding party in front of the old church, where they wrote graffiti against the Serbs on the very next day after the establishment of the SDA was announced. This old church was built during the days of the Turkish occupation. The anecdote says that the Sultan said, all right, you can build a church that will be as big as the skin of an ox. And then, allegedly, the Serbs cut this skin of an ox into a thread. And in this way, circle the area where the church would be built. The Sultan also said that it should not be higher than even the lowest minaret of all the mosques. They built the church partly underground, so you really have to walk downstairs when you walk into the church. I hope you go to Sarajevo one day. So watch your step when you go there. You go very deep down into the ground. This is a church that is very dear to the hearts of the Serbs. Anyway, the Muslims try to engage in deceit and say that this was not an active church. It was always an active church, even in the days of the Turks, and even the Turks did not touch it. So a young man hits Nikola Gardović, the father of the bridegroom, on that day. And already on the next day, he appears on TV as a hero. And he said, yes, I shot at him. Why would he carry a Serb flag? Serb flags were carried even in the Turkish days at weddings. It was not a national flag. It was a religious flag, and it was customary. Then on the 2nd of March, barricades were put up in Sarajevo. At the time, Professor Karadžić, Mr. Karadžić, and I are negotiating in Belgrade. So we were not there. Barricades were put up, and they were there for a few days. The SDS did negotiate with the presidency of Bosnia-Herzegovina with regard to these barricades, and the crisis staff that was headed by this gentleman who was arrested in London just now, Mr. Eyüp Ganić. He was a member of the presidency, a Yugoslav who turned against Yugoslavia. So in this situation, rife with tension, on the 18th of March, an agreement was reached, the Lisbon Agreement. The Kutiljero peace plan was adopted, stating that this territory of Bosnia-Herzegovina would be reorganized with 3 internal units of the Serb, Croat, and Muslim people, and we all celebrate. May I remind you that Mr. Ajanović celebrated the most, saying that 80 to 85% of all Muslims will be in their constituent unit, and only about 20% of the Serbs and Croats would be in their unit, whereas the Serbs fared the worst. Only 50-something% will be in the Serb unit, whereas the rest would be scattered throughout Bosnia. Even then, or after that, no one referred to any population exchanges or any expulsions. On the 24th of March, the SDA withdrew their agreement. I remind you that on the 18th of March, Ajanović said if the Serbs refuse this agreement, this is going to be yet another foolish thing that they are doing, and it will be proof that they had opted for war. However, a week later, they are the ones that annul the Lisbon Agreement. Mr. Ajanović says, well, we did this sort of as a trick in order to buy time, to wait for recognition, to wait for international recognition at that. Perhaps we could have a look at this slide. Could we have the previous one, actually? Yes. If the Serbian Assembly rejects the Kutiljero plan, it will become evident who is against peace in Bosnia, and it will become evident who wants to trick the European community and the chairman of the conference, Lord Carrington, that is. Excellencies, this is an admission. Who does that will be guilty. And this is exactly what he did a week later. The SDA originally accepted the Kutiljero agreement
because it was a political game to secure the international recognition of a sovereign and independent Bosnia and Herzegovina, and because it would be responsible for the failure of the negotiations. The SDS, HDZ, and the European community were in favor of B&H remaining in its present borders, but for its territories to be transformed. Ovo njemu nije bilo prihvatljivo.
Now, this is something that he found unacceptable. And on the 18th, 19th, he said, if this is deceit on the part of the Serbs, it is clear that they want to deceive the European community and they're to be blamed for the war. And now the gentleman admits that that's what they actually did and that thereby they were the ones who wanted war. The Serb people and the Serb political parties accepted the minimum. We leave Yugoslavia. That is the most painful concession we could have made. The borders of Bosnia-Herzegovina remain as they are if internally we get our own constituent units. This is what Ambassador Cutiliero wrote in 1995 when the war was already over. This is what he wrote about what was being said about the Lisbon Agreement. This is what Ambassador Cutiliero wrote. And he felt that he should make this public to the world and that it was not that way, not quite as he had put it. This is his letter.
Rounds of the talks, our principles for constitutional arrangements for Bosnia and Herzegovina were agreed by all three parties, Muslims, Serbs and Croats, in Sarajevo on 18th of March 1992. This continued until the Muslims reneged of the agreement. Had they not done so, the Bosnian question might have been settled earlier, with less loss of mainly Muslim life and land. To be fair, President Izetbegović and his aides were encouraged to scupper the deal and to fight for a unitary Bosnian state by well-meaning outsiders who thought they knew better. I ovo je trenutak da se
And this is the moment when we can also ask ourselves, what could Karadžić or the SDS do, or all the 1.5 million Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina? They accepted everything. They accepted everything that was consistent with their survival. They accepted that their unit should be the worst, that it should be the one least to satisfy the interests and goals of the Serb people, but they accept it all. And still, they don't have a chance of preserving peace. The only thing that is expected of them, quite obviously, is what President Tudjman told the American delegation. He said the Serbs should leave Bosnia, and not that the Muslims should leave Republika Srpska, but Serbs out of Bosnia. That's what he said. I have to go back to the wedding party and the killing there and the barricades. They are mostly interpreted in a biased way by the Western media. They said that the barricades were set up because the Muslims voted for independence. That's just not true. It's not true. We didn't prevent that anywhere. And let's have another look at the ethnic map of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Let's see that again. Wherever you see blue is where we were in power, because that was the Serb majority, the blue. And nobody in that area could they have conducted a referendum had we decided against it. So we didn't prevent it. Therefore, it's not true that the barricades were set up because of the referendum. They were set up because of the killing, because a young man, who was a well-known criminal, by the way, understood that it was okay to shoot at a Serb wedding party and kill someone, and he was even celebrated by his ethnic community as a hero. He wasn't arrested for a long time afterwards. And I think he was ultimately liquidated after the war, some 3 or 4 years ago, in some cafe somewhere. But nobody took any steps to apprehend him at that time. So that was the 24th and 25th of March, when it was published that the SDA had withdrawn from the meeting. Now, on the 25th of May, look at the rhythm, look at the tempo of this. We're no longer talking about a month or weeks as we were in Croatia. This is one shock after another, one day to the next. And we've now reached the 25th of March, where the armed forces of Croatia, the National Guards Corps, the MUP, whoever, you don't know who was active there. Anyway, they transferred from Croatia to Bosnia-Herzegovina, to Bosanski Brod, where they met illegal two paramilitary units, Pohara, who was the member of a party, but he had some military formations, whatever. They sang, they shot sporadically, and I think they shot, I think the man's name was Petrovic, they shot his son at a petrol pump, where they weren't, of course, allowed to shoot there. But when it came to shooting the Serbs, they went ahead and killed these two people. Nobody stood up to them, not the police of Bosnia-Herzegovina, not the Yugoslav People's Army, who couldn't do anything about it because they were busy fighting in Croatia already. And they continued the next day, that is to say on the 26th of March, in the neighboring village. The same thing happened as with the wedding party. Nobody stopped them and said, hang on, what are you doing? On the 26th of March, there was the slaughter of the Serbs in Sjekovac. And that poor village, Sjekovac, during World War II, well, a third of the population fled, a third of the population was converted, a third was killed. But some of them did not come back. Some of them were Catholics, of course. Now, the Serb side, and this accused here, was called up the people in the police saying, what's happening? Who's going to save the people? They said, we haven't got enough policemen. Why don't you recruit the reserve force? We can't without the minister. It was only the minister who was authorized to mobilize the reserve police force to go into action. Now, we asked them, we have the deputy minister, we have high-ranking officials in the ministry, we had Stanisic at the municipal level, we had Mandic at the Republican level. So we asked Mandic and Lepic, why aren't you doing something to mobilize a reserve police force? And their answer was, we can't. Somebody has to order us to do that. There was nobody to issue the order. There was no barrier between the killers and the Serb people, Serb civilians. There was no barrier. And the Serb Assembly was to establish that barrier on the 27th of March, the day after the slaughter, and 13 months after a far mightier body was set up by the SDA in February 1991, which was the National Security Council as an advisory body to the Assembly of the Serb people in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And the prosecutor deals with that in paragraph 66 of its pre-trial brief. And that is how the paragraph reads.
SNB was established by the Assembly on 27 March 1992 with Karadžić as its president. Although initially intended as an advisory body, the SNB in effect immediately turned into an executive organ, resembling a central Bosnian Serb crisis staff and executing powers similar to those of the presidency. Thus, as president of the SNB, Karadžić exercised authority over the Bosnian Serb state organs, that is, the Bosnian Serb forces and Republican, regional and municipal authorities. The SNB meeting in joint sessions with the Bosnian Serb government passed decisions on strategic and military issues, such as ordering the activation of the crisis staffs in certain conditions, appointing the acting commander of territorial defense, defending Serb positions reached, and ordering a full mobilization. Moreover, the SNB took important political decisions, such as the appointment of ministers and the adoption of legislation. Ovo naravno što
Now, of course, the fact that the prosecutor is summarizing, this only happened actually when the war broke out. Until the war broke out, this body, the Council for National Security, was an advisory body. An advisory body, as the title says. And for want of any other body, any command or any formations, the Serb Assembly decided to have the Serbs in the police, that the Assembly should, through the advice of an advisory body, issue orders to the police to save the people. And the decision was taken on the 28th of February, had been taken, that the Serb MUP be set up in conformity with the conference. However, it still had not been established and was still not working because it needed the agreement of the other two sides to go ahead. Of course, in a paragraph, the prosecutor says that Stanisic and Mandic did that off their own bat. It's got nothing to do with their volition. It was a decision taken by the Serb Assembly on the basis of the results of the conference on Bosnia-Herzegovina that was held in Lisbon under the presidency of Ambassador Cotillero, the presiding officer being Ambassador Cotillero. Now we come to the 1st of April. Agreements and decisions are being made in the police force about the division and of resources, the joint resources, and this was the distribution balance. The prosecutor sees this as a criminal act, but it was quite normal where you have an entity split in two, an organization split in two. You have to do the balance sheet to see what belongs to whom and who will get what in order to carry out their duty of keeping law and order. And agreements were reached in that respect and on that level. And on the 1st of April, the Muslim extremists attacked Bijeljina, not the Serb extremists, it was the Muslim extremists, and it was established here through all the testimonies heard in this tribunal that somebody was riding a horse and he wanted to throw a bomb on a Serb cafe. There's no justification for that. They say that 10 or 12 days prior to that, the Serbs had caused an incident. A Serb had caused an incident in a Muslim cafe. However, the police arrested that Serb and sent him to Tuzla, to Muslim territory. They escorted him there and handed him over to the authorities. So there was no justification for this act. It came as orders from Sarajevo to make Bijeljina a problem, to problematize Bijeljina so that they could take over power and authority. The prosecution says in its pre-trial brief the forcible taking of Bijeljina by the Serbs, etc., in one of the paragraphs of the indictment or pre-trial brief. That's completely absurd. It's absurd to say anything like that in view of the fact that Bijeljina municipality is predominantly Serb and that the authorities were the Serb Democratic Party and that everything was functioning properly. I would just like at this point to go back a bit, backtrack to paragraph 66 that we read out, where the prosecution says the following, that the council took over or had authority over Serb forces. Which Serb forces and which Republican organs existed at that point in time? That's the question. Not a single one is the answer. There was the assembly, which was working as a joint assembly, and in a joint assembly there were no executive organs, none at all, nowhere. It was just not in the SAOs, nowhere. They were prepared in case of chaos, and especially Serb forces, except for the territorial defense, which existed in all the municipalities. Until the 20th of May, there were no Serb forces. The prosecutor furthermore states that after the crisis in Bijeljina lasted 2 days. So they say that Arkan was called in from Belgrade, and the prosecutor, however, omits to say that there was a crisis and fighting in Bijeljina for a whole night, and that Arkan only arrived subsequently. Now, why did somebody call Arkan in? Because I don't justify this, and I don't condemn it either. All I want to do is throw light on the truth. Sjekovac is some 100 kilometers away from Bijeljina, and it was clear to one and all what had happened in Sjekovac. It was published, and what could the citizens of Bijeljina think but that they would suffer the same fate? And let me remind you that, and we have a map about this, and we'll address that in due course if we have time, but by the 1st of April, let me remind you, throughout Bosnia, it was only the Serbs who were being killed, whereas the prosecutor for that period of time is holding me accountable and accusing me of pursuing a policy of warmongering, and we can see that on this map. If we look at the border villages and the places in depth that were aflame, and it was exclusively against the Serbs that the barricades were set up in these areas. Checkpoints, killings were taking place, people were being beaten up, intimidated, exclusively the Serbs, until the war broke out, or rather the 1st of April. Now, the prosecutor goes on to say that leading official Biljana Plavčić of the SDS went to Bijeljina. Well, I don't want to defend myself from things of that kind. It's just improper. Biljana Plavčić was in Bijeljina as a member of the state presidency. It was a state delegation, not a party delegation, and it included Fikret Abdić, who was also not a member of the SDS. There was Jetko Dorko, the Minister of Defense, a Croat, who wasn't a member of the SDS either. So why was it that the prosecutor just focuses on Biljana Plavčić and noticed her and not the members of the presidency, the other ones, Abdić and so on? Well, it means that somebody is aiding and abetting the prosecutor, that people assisting the prosecutor are biased and helping the prosecutor in that way. Biljana Plavčić was a state official there, and it was a state delegation. On the 3rd of April, we have the attack on Kupres. May we have the map back again, please? It was an attack launched by Croatian forces, local Croatian forces, and forces, regular forces from Croatia. An attack on Kupres. Kupres was a very sensitive area. You had 52% Serbs, 40-odd% Muslims, and 7 or 8%, or rather 40% Croats and 8% Muslims. So that is the largest flame that broke out, the largest flame on the map there. That's where Kupres is. For Croats in central Bosnia, this is significant because it is a mountain ridge linking central Bosnia with Dalmatia and the coast. And that is where the fighting went on for several days, where the Serbs were slaughtered in Malovan, Vukovska, and the villages around Kupres. And it was a terrible, tremendous attack and tremendous suffering and fatalities on the part of the Serbs. But there was still not a war on, and the Serbs had nothing but the police to protect them, whereas the police was not actually protecting them but working against them, and the Yugoslav People's Army that didn't have time to deal with the situation. The Knin Corps appeared there, which tried to protect the people in the region. Now, on the 4th of April, the shocks didn't come every day, they came every hour. On the 4th of April, Mr. Izetbegovic proclaimed general mobilization. It is common knowledge, it was common knowledge to him that the Serbs wouldn't respond because they knew what the police was doing, they knew what the Patriotic League was doing, they knew what the Green Berets were doing. And so the Serbs, he knew, would not join those units because they were afraid, and it was their assumption that they would be killed. Karadžić calls up Izetbegovic and asks him to give up on the idea of mobilization. That is common knowledge. Karadžić says, why did you proclaim mobilization? Nikola Koljević and Biljana Plavčić was expressly against that, and he wasn't the president of Bosnia-Herzegovina, he was the president of the presidency, therefore a collective presidency. So he wasn't in a position to do that, and I told him that publicly, and we have the footage of this. I say it's madness. The people are armed. Nobody will be able to control the armament of the people, and now you're proclaiming general mobilization mobilization to legalize rifles which people are secreting. That is tantamount to a declaration of war, and we have footage of that. And on the 5th of April, I state that it was a mistake. To go ahead with that was a mistake. Recognition should be delayed, the conference should have been speeded up, and then we would have had peace. Instead of that, what was accelerated was recognition, and the conference was slowed down. That was a recipe for war. On the 5th of April, in the morning, the apartment of my family was bullet-ridden with a machine gun, and we have witnesses to bear out the fact that they were waiting to kill us. But we were all downstairs, but we were already in the Holiday Inn, the party offices, and they failed to kill us. On the 5th of April, Izetbegovic, Gljuic, and I left. Or was it Brkic? I don't remember. Anyway, we went to the television station with General Kukanjac to appeal for peace. At the same time, a day before, the Serb MUP was given agreement that the headquarters of the MUP should be in the school of the Ministry of the Interior at Vrabce, above Grbavica. So on that April the 5th, while we were broadcasting over television, the Serb MUP, which came to take up its offices, was held in ambush, and 2 wonderful young specials Serbs were killed. The other 30 men who came to help them take up their premises, they captured 140 Muslims and 400 of the pupils, but not a hair of their head was harmed, whereas these wonderful 2 young Serb men were killed. On the 5th and 6th of April, on the 5th of April in the evening, terror broke loose in Sarajevo. It was the worst night ever. There were snipers in all the high-rise buildings, Green Beret snipers. A policeman was killed in the joint police station. His name was Petrovic. By them, and it was terrible to be a Serb that night in Sarajevo. The Serbs withdrew to their own districts and areas and tried to defend those districts and their families and the people living in them. And that is how the line dividing the town was established. It wasn't a siege, a line of siege, but it was a line separating and dividing 2 parts of the town. Now, in the Milosevic trial, witness Ivan Prentice from Britain confirmed that it wasn't a city under siege, it was a city divided. And George Kenny from the State Department, who was well acquainted about our situation, said on his own initiative, without having to be asked by the prosecution or the defense, said that it was wrong to state that Sarajevo was a city under siege like Leningrad. Sarajevo was a divided city like Beirut, with one section of the population living in one area and the other in the other. In Beirut, it was common knowledge that after the working hours at 3 o'clock, shooting broke out, whereas by 3 p.m. everybody was at work.
On the 12th of April, Ambassador Cutilero arrives, and at that time, Vance was also in Sarajevo. We signed an agreement on truce with Mr. Cutilero. During the talks with Mr. Cutilero and Cyrus Vance, we established that we had to accelerate the defining of these 3 constituent units, because that could have stopped war. So if anyone knew that their village was going to be in certain constituent unit, they didn't have any need to fight. However, on the afternoon of that same day, Hassan Efendic, the then commander of the territorial defense, issued the well-known directive for combat readiness, which translated meant an attack on all Bosnian Serb targets. On the 22nd of April, this accused announced and offered his platform for the cessation of hostilities and the continuation of seeking for a political solution. This is a very important moment, and during this trial, we shall see that this was the position of the Serbian side, which were contained in documents. The Serbian positions were expressed in the Serbian Assembly. There was a provision that a deputy cannot be held accountable for his speech. However, an assembly is not there for people to deliver speeches, but rather to legislate, to adopt resolutions, declarations, decisions, conclusions, and recommendations. So at least 7 documents of that type were produced by the Assembly. And an instrument for producing this kind of documents is free debate. The OTP said that an enraged or angry deputy that was affected by something during the war said something in the Assembly, and they say that Karadžić didn't warn him and caution him. The president didn't have to be present in the Assembly. I was there often, but not always, and particularly the president is not a teacher who should discipline the deputies. That was not my place to do that and not my right. However, if I can see that this could affect some legislature or some other decision, then I intervened and tried to have an impact on the final outcome. In addition to thousands of documents officially adopted by the Assembly, published in the official gazette, the OTP couldn't find a single document to charge me with or to lay blame on me for it, although I was not responsible for that body. I was only responsible for signing documents in legislature, and I was entitled to refuse to put my signature. Among all these laws, decrees, and other documents that were adopted, the OTP did not rely on a single one that could have held this accused accountable for any breach of domestic legislature or any international instrument of international law. So this was the course of events that led to war between the 12th, when the elections were held. Let us look briefly at paragraph 78 of the pre-trial brief, where it says,
its inaugural session, Karadžić and the leadership planned that the Assembly would have a role in the acquisition of Serbian claimed territories. Znači, 24. oktobra.
So on the 24th of October, when we walked out of the assembly and decided to form our own assembly in order to exert pressure on the SDA to give up on their war plans, the OTP says, no, they established this. But this was in October 1991. They established this assembly to serve as an instrument for capturing territories. Can we please now look at the map again? The ethnic map. What territories were Serbs allegedly to capture? Those were already their territories. If you look at the front lines, you will see that
map. I od ovih teritorija koje su srpske,
Of these Serb territories held by them for centuries, the Serbs were prepared for the sake of peace to give up on some of them. You can see how it looks like without front lines, but now you're going to see how it looked like with the front lines.
A tužilaštvo kaže mi...
The OTP claimed that on the 24th of October we established our own assembly in order to Can we have it?
You have to turn on the Elmore or video.
Evo vidimo.
So you can see the same map. The Serbian forces, the Serbian people, the territorial defense. According to the law, every municipality had territorial defense. The president of the municipality was commander of the TO. Tito's doctrine of an armed people should be taken, and an underlying reason for all the explanations that we can offer. Bosnia, like other countries, had their own armed forces, and these people went to the edges of their own territories in order to prevent slaughter. These were the front lines throughout the entire war. If you look at the central part, Your Excellencies, had we advanced further on, we would have benefited from that because we would have shortened the front lines and increased the deployment of our forces and include our reserve forces. However, if the Croat forces advanced, they would have stretched their front and would have been weakened. So from the strategic point of view, if we had advanced, we could have been more strong. We could have been stronger, and we could have captured the whole of Bosnia. Now, what the OTP claims about our assembly being established to prevent any violation of the Constitution, they say that this was created in order to take over the territories that were already ours. We never left our own ethnic territories, and the fact that there were Muslims in Prijedor and eastern Bosnia, wherever there were 20 or 30,000 Serbs or Muslims or Croats, this could have become a canton without war. So I have to defend myself from the allegations that we didn't have enough power on the 24th of October or the 27th March or the 6th of April, or because we had our own forces only on the 20th of May, not counting the territorial defense. The territorial defense existed in every enterprise, in every company. That was the concept of an armed people. We have a situation different than in the rest of the world, and in order for you to understand that, you should know that even every company had their own territorial unit and its weapons, and that particularly applied to municipalities.
Ekscelencije, ne znam da li sam...
Your Excellency, I don't know if I managed to portray for you this horrible course of events against the Serbs, who constituted 1/3, who were not organized in any respect other than having its own assembly and its deputies, who were partly performing in the joint assembly and partly trying to protect the Serbian people from their own state, from the police, from the state-sponsored terror of their own country.
Da se malo osvrnemo na to šta je ta policija.
Now let us see what the police was doing. Why did the SDS ask Ambassador Cutilero for the constituent unit to have their own police forces? Everywhere in the world, the police forces are decentralized all the way down to the level of a municipality. In the US, you have city and district police forces, and there are state police forces, and then you have federal police forces, and this is what we were asking for. Let us just see what this police did. I'm talking about the joint police, in which we had our representatives and our own positions won at democratic elections.
Zajednička policija je odmah
At the very beginning, the joint police forces set out to effect Muslim supremacy and the SDA, the government organs, the police, and the Green Berets and the police became almost one and were equal to one another. And all of that was under the control of the SDS. The number one man in the joint police of Bosnia-Herzegovina was priest Hasan Cengic, who was not a member of the police. For example, on the 11th of July 1991, while we were in negotiations with Zulfikar Pašić and Filipović about the historic Serbian-Muslim agreement supported by Izetbegović,
DA issued instructions for sending candidates of the MUP Educational Center in Croatia. And this instruction is number 1258, 391. O čemu se radi?
What is this all about? In secrecy, behind the back of the Serb deputy of minister, Mr. Stanisic, and Mr. Stanisic, who was chief of police for Sarajevo, preparations were made to send groups of policemen to Croatia, who was at the time fighting against Yugoslavia. They were being sent to undergo training so that they can repeat the same activities that Croatia pursued. You can also see a lot of indications of what they did. Hasan Cengic, his father, Halid Cengic, was the first one to establish the first armed unit in Foča in August 1990, before the elections. Hasan Cengic took control of
officials of the Bosnian and Croatian police, UP, and pursuant to the instructions regarding the employment of police candidates as the Croatian MUP Educational Center, the SDA recommends the above-mentioned candidates for the course at your center. Ovo je popratno pismo.
This is a cover letter sent with a list of Muslim policemen who were to be trained in Zagreb secretly. This cover letter was not signed by anyone from the police, but rather by a person from the SDA. And this is a proof that there was a complete merger between the SDA and the Muslim part of the police. So this is how this joint MUP looks like, and there was a reason good enough for us to leave the police, but this wasn't done until 1991. the police is intercepting politicians' conversations, private conversations of ordinary citizens, etc. We are going to see a lot of intercept of that kind. I'm not concerned about that at all. They are going to be very helpful to see what was done at the time. I recently asked to be provided with intercepts of conversations between Izetbegovic, Karadžić, and others. I naively suppose that if they listened in to everybody's conversation, I could have them, but it turns out that the only ones whose telephones were tapped were the Serbs. So until that moment, the SDA established
Patriotic League. SDA obstructed the appointments of SDS personnel in the MUP, of Serbian personnel in the MUP. SDA replaced a large number of Serbian employees in Bosnian MUP. SDA sent Muslim police personnel to the Croatian MUP for military training u trenutku kada Hrvatska ratuje protiv Jugoslavije.
That was at the time when Croatia was in war with Yugoslavia.
Mobilization of the reserve forces for Bosnian MUP. SDA illegally intercepted telephone conversations of the Serbian leadership. I mnoštvo drugih stvari, ali ovo je...
And they did a lot of other things, but these are the most striking ones, describing what our government partners were doing without any court decisions, and they shouldn't have done that without proper court decisions.
Ne treba ni da vam kažem da je...
Needless to say that the SDS and the entire Serbian nation knew about all this, but without a smoking gun and without solid proof, there was no way to disclose that. And even when that was divulged, this was refuted immediately, and the Serbian side was accused of corrupting inter-ethnic relations and raising tensions. Here is one conversation between the accused and the deputy minister, who was a Serb but not a member of the SDS, but he was nominated by the Serbs to protect the Serbian interests and to be part of the checks and balances. Let's hear it. Karadžić can only made a decision to call upon the Muslims to join the territorial defense, and some people around him are ready to start the war. We know that quite well. They are preparing a war. They organize the main staff. You don't know that where the staff is. There is a huge number of armed people. There are preparations for war. There are drills to block barracks. There are counter maneuvers of the army, and here they are going for war. They want the unlawful way, although we've proved to them that they cannot legally or politically carry that out. We've told them to use the constitutional procedure to change the constitution, but they don't want to because they don't know they stand a chance with the international public. They don't stand a chance within the legal system. The only chance they've got is to try and trick us, but the Serbs won't allow that.
Izetbegovic is getting a chance to achieve what no one has ever achieved. That is to establish an Islamic state in Europe. Karadžić, Europe, they know what it is. They don't need us. They would make the state without us, but Europe would not recognize an Islamic, that is a Muslim state at all, and that's a big problem for them. They're trying to make us their hostages of their state.
Evo, to je 17. juni.
That was the 17th of June, 1991. My conversation with our top representative in the police force, who will come here to confirm this. although there is really no need to have this confirmed.
Verujem da više ne treba o MUP-u. Sad je vreme.
I believe that there is no need for me to go on about the MOOP any longer. It's time for the break anyway, isn't it? The MOOP was then the strongest support of the war policy of the SDA anyway.
Yes.
Ekscelencijo, da li je...
Excellency, is it the right time to take the break now? I can go on.
No, we'll take a break for 20 minutes.
All rise. Forgive vous lever.